The colony ship Horizon Dawn had traveled for 18 months through the empty darkness of space. Inside, 15,000 people slept in frozen chambers, dreaming of a new world. Captain Richard Hayes was the first to wake up when the ship's computers signaled their arrival. He opened his eyes slowly, feeling the cold leave his body as the warming systems brought him back to life. Richard walked to the bridge and looked at the viewing screen. There it was, the planet they had come so far to find. It looked like a green and blue jewel hanging in the black sky. 2 small suns burned on either side of it, giving the world a warm glow. This was Kepler 442b, and it was going to be humanity's new home. The landing took 3 days. One by one, the sleeping colonists woke up. They gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the ship that had carried them across the stars. When the first transport shuttle touched down on the planet's surface, people cheered and cried. After so long in the metal corridors of the ship, they could finally breathe fresh air again. The air smelled sweet like flowers and rain. The grass under their feet was softer than earth grass, and it had a purple tint to it. Strange birds flew overhead, making sounds like bells ringing. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect, some of the older colonists whispered to each other. But most people were too happy to worry. They built their settlement in a wide valley between tall mountains. The mountains had white peaks that sparkled in the light of the 2 suns. A clear river ran through the valley, providing clean water. Within 2 weeks, New Portland had grown from a few temporary shelters to a real town. Pre-made buildings were assembled. Power generators hummed to life, and farms were planted with seeds from Earth. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Moore was in charge of exploring the area around the colony. She was a tall woman with short black hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. On the 15th day after landing, she took a team of 6 soldiers into the forest to the north. They wanted to map the land and look for any dangers. The trees in the forest were huge, bigger than the oldest redwoods on Earth. Their bark was dark red, and their leaves made a thick canopy overhead. The team walked for 3 hours, marking their path and taking samples. Everything was quiet. Too quiet, Patricia thought. She had been on enough worlds to know that forests should be noisy with animal sounds. Then they found the marks. Deep gouges in the tree bark, running from high above down to the ground. Whatever made them had claws as long as knives. The team stopped and checked their weapons. Patricia called back to base on her radio, reporting what they had found. They found more signs as they went deeper. Scorch marks on the ground where the earth had been burned so hot it had turned to glass. Bones scattered in clearings, picked clean of meat and arranged in strange patterns. Some of the bones were from the local deer-like animals they had seen. Others were from creatures they had not yet encountered, huge things that must have weighed several tons. The attack came without warning. The sky darkened as something massive blocked out the light. Patricia looked up and her blood turned cold. A creature was diving toward them from the sky, and it looked like something from an ancient legend. It had scales as black as midnight, wings that spread wider than a house, and a long serpentine neck. When it opened its mouth, Patricia saw rows of teeth like swords. She screamed for her team to scatter. They ran in different directions, trying to reach the cover of the trees. The creature landed with a sound like thunder, its claws digging deep furrows in the ground. It turned its massive head toward the nearest soldier, a young man named Carl, and opened its jaws. Fire poured out. Not normal fire, but a stream of white-hot plasma that turned the air itself into a furnace. Carl didn't even have time to scream. The heat consumed him in an instant. The second soldier, a woman named Lisa, raised her rifle and fired. The bullets bounced off the creature's scales like raindrops. The creature's tail whipped around and struck her, sending her flying into a tree. She didn't get up. Patricia and the remaining 3 soldiers ran. Behind them, they heard the creature roar. It was a sound that shook the ground and made their bones vibrate. Then they heard the beating of giant wings. Patricia risked a look back and saw the creature rising into the air. It held the 3rd soldier, a man named Kevin, in its claws. Kevin was screaming and struggling, but he might as well have been fighting a mountain. The creature flew away, carrying Kevin with it. Patricia and her 2 remaining team members ran all the way back to the colony, not stopping even when their lungs burned and their legs felt like they would give out. When they burst through the colony gates, dirty and terrified, everyone knew something terrible had happened. Patricia went straight to Captain Hayes and told him everything. Within an hour, the entire colony was on high alert. Security Chief Danny Craig was a short, muscular man with gray hair and a face like old leather. He had fought in the resource wars back on Earth and had seen terrible things. But when he watched the video from Patricia's helmet camera, even he looked shaken. The creature was bigger than anything he had ever faced. Worse, it moved with intelligence. It hadn't attacked randomly. It had targeted the armed soldiers first. Danny ordered every defense system activated. Automated turrets rose from their hidden positions around the colony perimeter. Energy shields flickered to life. Every colonist who could hold a weapon was given one and told to stay alert. But everyone knew the truth. Their weapons were designed to fight other humans, not flying monsters that breathed fire. The attacks continued. Over the next week, the creature came back again and again. Sometimes it would circle high above the colony for hours, its shadow making people look up in fear. They could hear its cries. Long, piercing shrieks that echoed off the mountains. Other times it would swoop down without warning, snatch livestock from the pens and fly away before anyone could react. People started calling it the dragon. There was no other word that fit. Some colonists wondered if there was more than one. The creature seemed to attack from different directions, sometimes appearing in two places within minutes of each other. But whether it was one dragon or many, the result was the same. New Portland was under siege. Dr. Helen Brooks was the colony's chief scientist and expert in alien life. She studied every piece of footage they had of the dragon. She watched it move, watched it hunt, watched it fly. The more she studied, the more worried she became. This was not just an animal acting on instinct. The dragon's attacks showed planning and strategy. It tested their defenses, probed for weaknesses, and never attacked the same way twice. The colony council met every night trying to decide what to do. Some wanted to pack up and leave to get back on the Horizon Dawn and find another world. Others wanted to fight, to hunt the dragon and kill it. Captain Hayes listened to all the arguments but made no decision. Deep down, he knew they couldn't leave. They had used too much fuel getting here. The Horizon Dawn could maybe reach one more star system, but there was no guarantee they would find another habitable world. On the 8th night after the first attack, Maria Martinez sat in her family's living quarters, holding her daughter Sophie close. Sophie was only 6 years old with dark curly hair and bright brown eyes. She didn't seem scared of the dragon like the other children. Instead, she asked her mother questions about it. What did it eat? Where did it sleep? Did it have a family? Maria's son Lucas, who was 13, was supposed to be watching Sophie while Maria helped reinforce the medical bay, but Lucas was exhausted and frightened. The constant alerts and the fear that hung over the colony like a cloud had worn him down. He fell asleep in his chair, his rifle resting against the wall beside him. Sophie looked at her sleeping brother. Then she looked at the door. She had seen something earlier, when she had been playing near the fence. Pretty flowers that glowed with a soft blue light, growing just outside the colony perimeter. She wanted those flowers. They were the most beautiful things she had seen on this new world. Moving quietly so she wouldn't wake Lucas, Sophie slipped out the door. The colony was busy with people rushing back and forth, strengthening defenses and preparing for another possible attack. Nobody noticed one small girl walking toward the outer fence. Sophie found the gap in the fence that the maintenance crews hadn't fixed yet. It was small, but she was smaller. She squeezed through and ran toward the glowing flowers. They were even prettier up close, their blue light pulsing gently like tiny heartbeats. Sophie began picking them, making a bouquet. She was so focused on the flowers that she didn't notice the shadow growing around her. She didn't hear the whisper of giant wings until it was too late. When Sophie finally looked up, the dragon was landing right in front of her. The dragon landed with such force that the ground shook beneath Sophie's feet. Dirt and small stones flew up in a cloud around its massive claws. Each claw was as long as Sophie was tall, curved and sharp like giant black knives. The creature was even more terrifying up close than it had looked in the videos her mother thought she hadn't seen. Sophie stood frozen, clutching her bouquet of glowing blue flowers. The dragon was enormous. Standing on all four legs, its shoulder was higher than the roof of her family's house. Its body was covered in scales that looked black at first, but when the light hit them right, Sophie could see deep purples and blues swirling in the darkness. A row of sharp spikes ran down its back from its head all the way to the tip of its long tail. Its wings were folded against its sides now, but Sophie remembered seeing them spread wide in the videos. They had blocked out the sky. Steam rose from the dragon's nostrils. The air around it seemed to shimmer and wave like the air above hot pavement on a summer day. Sophie could feel the heat coming off its body, making her face warm even though she was several steps away. Inside the colony, Alarms started blaring. The security cameras had spotted Sophie outside the fence. They had spotted the dragon landing. Danny Craig was already running toward the main gate, grabbing the biggest plasma rifle they had. But he knew he would never reach her in time. The dragon could kill the little girl in a heartbeat. Maria Martinez heard the alarms and knew instantly that something was wrong. She ran to her living quarters and found Lucas awake now, standing by the open door, his face white with terror. Sophie was gone. Maria's scream could be heard across the entire settlement. People held her back as she tried to run toward the gate. If she went out there, the dragon would kill her too. The dragon lowered its massive head, bringing one huge eye level with Sophie. The eye was bigger than a dinner plate with a pupil like a cat's, a vertical black slit in the middle of burning gold. Sophie could see herself reflected in that eye, a tiny figure in a yellow dress holding flowers. She looked very small. The dragon's pupil got narrower as it focused on her. Sophie could smell something strange, like the air before a thunderstorm, sharp and electric. She could also smell something sweet, like honey and cinnamon mixed together. The dragon's breath was hot on her face, making her hair blow back. Sophie did what she always did when meeting someone new. She smiled. Back on Earth, before they left, she had lived near her grandfather's farm. She had made friends with all the animals there. Dogs, cats, chickens, even a grumpy old goat named Fred who didn't like anybody else. Sophie had never met an animal that scared her. "Hi," Sophie said. Her voice sounded very small in the open air, but it was clear and not shaking. "You're really big." The dragon's head tilted to one side. It was such a familiar gesture, like a curious dog trying to understand something. Its jaws opened slightly, showing teeth longer than Sophie's arm. Each tooth was curved and sharp, designed to tear through meat and bone. The adults watching through the security cameras thought this was the end. They waited for fire, for violence, for the worst to happen, but fire didn't come. Instead, the dragon breathed out slowly. It was just a breath, not an attack. The air that came from its lungs smelled like that sweet cinnamon smell, mixed with something else Sophie couldn't identify. The force of the breath blew her hair back and made her dress flutter, but it didn't hurt her. Sophie took a step closer. Through the security feed back at the colony, Maria Martinez sobbed and struggled against the people holding her. Danny Craig had reached the gate but stood there, helpless. If he went out shooting, he might hit Sophie. If the dragon wanted to hurt her, it would have done so already. "Are you lonely?" Sophie asked the dragon. She didn't know why she asked that. The words just came out. But looking at the creature, at its huge golden eyes, she thought she saw something there. Something sad. The dragon made a sound. It wasn't a roar or a screech. It was lower, rumbling like thunder heard from far away. Sophie felt it in her chest more than she heard it with her ears. The sound made her think of her cat back on Earth, how it would purr when Sophie pet it. Slowly, very slowly, the dragon lowered its head even more. Its snout came down until it was less than an arm's length from Sophie's face. She could see every scale clearly now. They weren't just black. Up close, she could see colors moving in them like oil floating on water. Midnight blue, deep green, dark purple, all swirling and shifting. The heat from the dragon's scales was strong but not burning. It felt like standing near a fireplace in winter. Sophie liked it. The new planet got cold at night and the warmth felt good. Sophie reached up with one small hand. She let her flowers fall to the ground. Her hand looked impossibly tiny as she stretched it toward the dragon's nose. The adults watching held their breath. This was it, the moment when the dragon would snap at her, when those terrible jaws would close. Sophie's hand touched the dragon's snout, right above its nostril. The scales were smooth and warm, almost hot. They felt like polished stone that had been sitting in the sun all day. Each scale overlapped the next one in a perfect pattern like roof tiles. Sophie ran her fingers across them gently. The dragon's eye closed. Just for a moment. Then it opened again and Sophie saw something in that golden eye that made her certain. The dragon wasn't a monster. It was just scared like everyone else. Sophie leaned forward. She had to stand on her tiptoes to reach. Then she kissed the dragon's snout, right on the smooth scale above its nostril. Her lips pressed against the warm scales for just a second. "You're not scary," Sophie whispered so quietly that only the dragon could hear. "You're beautiful." The dragon went completely still. For several long heartbeats, nothing happened. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Then slowly and carefully, the dragon began to back away. Its movements were gentle, almost delicate, like it was afraid of stepping on something precious. The dragon's wings unfolded, spreading wide. They were even more magnificent up close, the membranes between the wing bones thin enough to let light through, showing patterns like stained glass. With two powerful beats that kicked up dust and bent the glowing flowers flat against the ground, the dragon launched itself into the air. But it didn't fly away to the mountains. Instead, it circled above Sophie. Once, twice, 3 times it flew around her, each circle lower than the last. Sophie stood in the middle, turning to watch it, her face bright with wonder. On the final pass, flying so low that its belly nearly touched the ground, the dragon dropped something. It fell and landed with a heavy thump near Sophie's feet. It was an animal, one of the deer-like creatures that lived in the forests. It was freshly killed, still warm, with no marks on it except where the dragon's claws had held it. Sophie understood. It was a gift. The dragon was giving her food, the way cats sometimes brought mice to their owners. She looked up at the dragon and waved. The dragon rose higher into the air. It opened its jaws and made a sound, a long cry that was different from the screams the colonist had heard before. This sound wasn't angry or threatening. It was almost musical, rising and falling. Then the dragon flew away toward the mountains, becoming smaller and smaller until it disappeared. Danny Craig reached Sophie 10 seconds after the dragon left. He scooped her up in his arms and ran back toward the colony as fast as he could, not stopping even when his legs burned and his breath came in gasps. He was sure the dragon would come back, that it had just been playing with them. But Sophie wasn't scared. She was smiling, the biggest smile Danny had ever seen, and in her hand, clutched tight in her small fist, was something the dragon had left behind, a single scale black with blue swirling through it. It must have fallen from the dragon's hide when Sophie touched it. Maria Martinez met them at the gate. She grabbed Sophie from Danny's arms and held her so tight that Sophie squeaked in protest. Maria was crying and laughing at the same time, checking Sophie for any injuries, any burns, any sign that the dragon had hurt her. "I'm okay, Mama," Sophie said, squirming in her mother's grip. "The dragon was nice. Look what it gave me." She held up the scale. That night, the Colony Council held an emergency meeting. Every leader was there, along with Danny Craig, Patricia Moore, and Maria Martinez. Dr. Helen Brooks had the scale that Sophie had given her, and she was running every test she could think of. Sophie herself was asleep in her bed, exhausted from her adventure. She had tucked the scale under her pillow after her mother had promised to give it back in the morning. She dreamed of flying, of seeing the world from high above, of a new friend with wings and golden eyes. Dr. Brooks projected her findings on the main screen in the meeting room. The scale was incredible. It was made of materials that shouldn't exist together. Organic and inorganic compounds woven together at a molecular level. It was stronger than steel but lighter than plastic. The structure showed signs of being deliberately created, not just grown naturally. "This changes everything," Helen said, looking around at the council. "This scale shows advanced biological engineering. Either the dragons have technology we don't understand, or they are technology. Either way, they're not simple animals." Captain Hayes leaned back in his chair, thinking hard. "The attacks," he said slowly. "Tell me about the targets again." Captain Hayes stood at the window of the command center, watching the dragon sitting in the field. It had been there for 3 hours now, not moving except to shift its weight occasionally, or to turn its head to track people moving inside the colony. The morning sun made its scales shine with colors that the security cameras couldn't quite capture. "We have to try," Hayes said finally. "We can't live in fear forever, and we can't fight something that big and win." Dr. Helen Brooks nodded. She had spent all night studying the dragon's behavior, reviewing every second of footage they had. The more she watched, the more convinced she became that they were dealing with intelligence, not animal instinct. "The pattern is clear," Helen said, pointing to charts on her tablet. "Every attack happened after we did something threatening. Cut down trees in their territory, set up weapon systems, fired first. But with Sophie, who offered no threat, it was gentle. So we go out there unarmed?" Danny Craig looked skeptical. The security chief had seen too much combat to trust easily. "Not unarmed," Hayes said, "but not threatening. We make contact. Real contact. We try to communicate." The argument that followed lasted an hour. Some council members thought it was suicide. Others thought it was their only chance. In the end, Hayes made the decision as captain. They would try. The hard part was convincing Maria Martinez to let Sophie be part of the contact team. The little girl had woken up that morning full of questions about the dragon. Was it still here? Could she see it again? Could she give it more flowers? When she heard the adults talking about making contact, she had pushed her way into the meeting room and declared that she wanted to help. Absolutely not, Maria had said immediately. But Sophie was stubborn, a trait she had inherited from her mother. The dragon likes me, Mama, Sophie said. It gave me a present. It didn't hurt me. I can talk to it. You're 6 years old, baby. You can't talk to dragons. Why not? Nobody else can either. At least it didn't try to eat me. Helen had knelt down to Sophie's level. Sophie, this is very dangerous. We don't know if the dragon will be friendly again. It might have just been curious yesterday. It was lonely, Sophie said with the absolute certainty that children sometimes have. I could tell, and it's still waiting out there. It wants to talk to us too. In the end, Maria agreed, but only because the alternative was living in constant fear and because Sophie had already proven she could survive meeting a dragon. The contact team was formed carefully. Helen would lead it along with Dr. Peter Kim, who studied languages, and Dr. Claire Hughes, who studied cultures. Sophie would go with them. And Danny Craig insisted on coming too, with 4 armed security officers, though Hayes made the rules very clear. Weapons down unless directly attacked. No shooting first. No threatening gestures. They spent 2 days preparing. They set up a meeting place in the field where the dragon waited. A simple shelter, open on all sides so the dragon could see they weren't hiding anything. A table with gifts, human technology, and art. Sophie insisted on bringing flowers again, the same glowing blue ones from before. The dragon watched all the preparations but didn't approach. It just sat there, patient, like it understood what they were trying to do. On the morning of the 3rd day, everything was ready. The contact team walked out through the main gate. Sophie held Helen's hand on one side and her mother's on the other. Maria had refused to stay behind. If her daughter was walking out to meet a dragon, she would be there too. The dragon saw them coming. It stood up from its sitting position, and even though the team had known how big it was, seeing it stand up was still shocking. It was taller than a 2-story building. Its shadow fell over them like a cloud. Sophie let go of the adult's hands and walked forward. She was holding the flowers in both hands, the blue glow bright against her yellow dress. Hi again, she called out. I brought you more flowers. The dragon lowered its head, bringing its eye level with Sophie just like before. The team could hear it breathing, deep slow breaths that moved air like a wind. Then something amazing happened. From the sky above, 3 more dragons appeared. The security team tensed, hands moving toward weapons. Danny Craig's heart pounded, but he kept his hands still, kept his gun pointed at the ground. This was the moment. Either they all died here or something new began. The 3 new dragons landed around the first one. One was smaller, its scales more blue than black. One was enormous, even bigger than the first, with scales the color of deep red wine. The third was sleek and silver, its eyes glowing like amber gems. They formed a loose circle around the contact team, but they didn't attack. They just watched. Sophie looked at all of them, her eyes wide but not frightened. Then she did something that made Helen's breath catch. She walked up to the first dragon, the one she had met before, and placed the flowers on the ground in front of it. Then she stepped back and bowed, just like her mother had taught her to do when meeting important people. The black dragon's eyes widened, showing more gold. Then it reared up on its hind legs, its front claws coming off the ground. Its wings spread wide, blocking out the sun. The security team almost broke and ran. This was an attack posture. This was what the dragon did right before it breathed fire, but fire didn't come. Instead, the dragon sang. The sound that came from its throat was like nothing the humans had ever heard. It was musical, but not like any music from Earth. It had layers, multiple notes all at once, high and low together, creating harmonies that shouldn't be possible from one voice. The song rose and fell, carried across the valley, and from the mountains in the distance, more voices answered. Not screams or roars, but songs. Beautiful, complex songs. Dr. Kim was frantically recording everything, his equipment trying to capture and analyze the sounds. His hands were shaking with excitement. This was language. This was communication. This was proof of intelligence. When the song ended, the black dragon settled back onto all four legs. It looked at Sophie with an expression that Helen could only describe as pleased. Then it reached out with one massive claw, very carefully, and pushed the flowers back toward Sophie. "It's refusing the gift," Peter Kim muttered, watching closely. "No, wait. It's not refusing. It's returning the gesture. It's showing respect." The dragon opened its jaws slowly. The humans tensed, but again, no fire came. Instead, the dragon produced something else. It was a crystal, clear as diamond, about the size of a baseball. It glowed from within with a soft white light. The dragon placed it gently on the ground and pushed it toward Sophie with the tip of its snout. Sophie picked up the crystal. It was warm in her hands, and the light inside it seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. She held it up, watching the light dance and swirl. "Thank you," Sophie said seriously. "It's beautiful." The dragon made that rumbling purr sound again, the one Sophie had heard yesterday. Then it did something that made Helen gasp. The dragon touched its snout to its chest with one claw, then extended the claw toward Sophie, palm up, in a gesture that looked almost human. "It's introducing itself," Helen breathed. "That's a formal greeting, a presentation." Sophie, with the confidence that came from having no idea how dangerous this moment was, copied the gesture. She put her hand on her chest, then extended it toward the dragon. The dragon's eyes seemed to brighten. It brought its claw down and touched it gently to Sophie's hand. The contact lasted only a second, but in that second something changed. The dragon made a sound, a specific combination of notes that Peter's equipment registered as subsonic rumbles mixed with higher harmonics. "That's a name," Peter said, his voice excited. "It just told us its name." Sophie tilted her head, listening to the echo of the sound. She couldn't make the rumbling part. Her voice box wasn't built for it, but she tried to copy the higher notes. "Vexcar?" she said, making it sound like two words. The dragon's eyes widened. Then it made another sound, different but similar, and pointed its claw at Sophie. "It's asking for your name," Helen said softly. "Sophie," the little girl said clearly. "My name is Sophie." The dragon tried to repeat it, but the sounds came out wrong, twisted by a throat not made for human speech. It sounded like Sophia with extra rumbles and harmonics. But it was close enough. Sophie smiled and nodded. Over the next hour, more gestures were exchanged. The dragon seemed to have a whole language of movements and positions. A claw placed a certain way meant one thing. A head tilt meant another. Wings held at specific angles conveyed different messages. Peter and Claire recorded everything, building a basic dictionary of dragon body language. The breakthrough came when Vexcar, as Sophie had named the black dragon, did something unexpected. It extended one of its wings, and in the membrane between the supporting bones, images began to appear. Glowing patterns of light like a living screen. The humans stared in amazement. The images showed Sophie approaching Vexcar that first evening, but they also showed something the security cameras hadn't captured. Around Sophie, in the dragon's vision, there was a lack of something, a darkness or an absence. The adult humans, shown in other images, were surrounded by a glowing fog in reds and oranges. But Sophie had been clear, no fog around her at all. "They can see our emotions," Helen whispered in awe. "Some kind of sense, maybe thermal or bioelectric. They literally see what we're feeling." The weeks that followed the first contact were filled with careful steps and small victories. Every morning the contact team would meet with what they now called the Dragon Council in the field, between the colony and the forest. Vexcar was always there, along with the 3 other dragons who had appeared that first day. Sometimes more dragons would come, watching from a distance, learning about humans the way humans were learning about them. Dr. Peter Kim worked day and night on understanding dragon communication. The songs were incredibly complex, carrying multiple layers of meaning in a single phrase. A change in pitch could turn a greeting into a question. A shift in the harmonics could add emotional context, and the subsonic rumbles, which humans couldn't hear without equipment, carried even more information. But the real breakthroughs came through Sophie. The 6-year-old girl had a gift that the adult scientists couldn't explain. She would sit with Vexcar for hours, and somehow they understood each other. It wasn't quite language, not the way adults thought of language. It was something simpler and more direct. Intention, emotion, pure meaning without words getting in the way. One afternoon, Sophie came running back from a session with Vexcar, her face bright with excitement. She found Captain Hayes and Dr. Brooks in the command center. They thought we were the bad things, Sophie announced, breathing hard from her run. The Scourers. That's what Vexcar calls them. Bad things that came from the sky a really, really long time ago. Hayes knelt down to Sophie's level. Can you tell us about the Scourers, Sophie? Sophie nodded, serious now. They came in ships like ours. They landed and started eating everything. Not eating like with mouths, but taking everything apart. Trees, animals, rocks, everything. They made the world sick. The dragons had to fight them for many, many seasons. Lots of dragons died. Finally, all the Scourers were gone, but the dragons never forgot. Dr. Brooks was recording everything, and they thought we were more Scourers when we landed. Yes, because our ship looked like the Scourer ships, and because we started cutting down trees and changing things. The dragons were scared. They thought it was happening again. That's why they attacked the people with guns first. They were trying to protect their home. The revelation explained so much. The targeted attacks on armed personnel, the way the dragons had tested the colony's defenses. They hadn't been acting as animals protecting territory. They had been acting as defenders fighting off what they thought was an invasion. But they stopped attacking after you met Vexcar, Hayes said gently. Why? Sophie smiled. Because I didn't smell like fear or hate. Vexcar says they can see feelings like colors around people. People who are scared or angry or want to hurt things have red and orange colors. But I was just purple and blue and happy colors. He said I looked like Dragon Young look, curious and friendly. Over the next weeks, more understanding grew. The dragons began bringing their young to the meetings, letting them observe from a safe distance. The young dragons were smaller, about the size of horses, with scales that hadn't fully hardened yet. They made chirping sounds instead of the deep songs of the adults, and they played with each other like puppies, tumbling and jumping and learning to fly. Sophie was enchanted by them. She begged to play with the young dragons, and eventually, after much discussion and worry, the adults agreed. The first time a young dragon, its scales bright green and gold, approached Sophie carefully, everyone held their breath. But the dragon young just sniffed her curiously, made a happy chirping sound, and touched its nose to her hand. Within a week, Sophie and 3 of the dragon young were inseparable. They played games that transcended species, tag and hide and seek, and simple wrestling that the young dragons were very careful to keep gentle. The adult dragons watched with what could only be described as approval. The language barrier was slowly breaking down. Peter had developed a translation device that could convert human speech into dragon harmonics, though it was clumsy and often got things wrong. The dragons seemed to find it amusing when the device made mistakes. They would make sounds that the humans learned to recognize as laughter. The big breakthrough came when Lieutenant Aaron Peters returned. He walked into the colony one morning, escorted by 2 dragons looking healthy but changed. He had been missing for 32 days, taken in that first attack. Everyone had assumed he was dead. Peters told his story to a gathering of the entire colony. The dragons hadn't killed him. They had taken him to their city deep in the mountains to observe him and learn about humans. He had been treated well, given food and shelter, and taught the dragon ways. They have technology, Peters said, his voice full of wonder. Not like ours, but just as advanced. Maybe more. They grow their tools and buildings from living crystal. They can shape it with their minds somehow, or with sounds we can't hear. Their city is beautiful. Spires that grow from the cave walls, glowing with light from within. They have libraries filled with crystal records of their history going back thousands of years. He showed them what he had brought back. Crystal devices that stored information, shown as images like the ones Vexcar had displayed on his wing. Tools that could cut stone with focused sound. A healing crystal that Peter said had cured a broken bone in his arm that he'd gotten in the capture. The bone had healed perfectly in 3 days. They're not just intelligent, Peter said. They're wise. They've been on this world for so long they understand it in ways we never could. They know every plant, every animal, every weather pattern. They're part of this world, not just living on it. The Colony Council met with the Dragon Council for a formal discussion, with Sophie and Peters acting as translators. The dragons had a proposal. They would share the world, but there had to be rules. Certain areas were sacred to the dragons, nesting grounds and crystal growth sites. These had to be protected. The humans could build and farm, but they had to learn the dragon way of working with the land instead of just taking from it. In return, the dragons were willing to teach crystal growing techniques that could revolutionize human technology, medicine that could cure diseases human science couldn't touch, maps of the world showing resources and dangers, and protection. The dragons could fly fast and far, seeing threats from the air that humans on the ground would miss. Captain Hayes stood before the Dragon Council and agreed to the terms. The alliance was sealed with a ceremony that mixed human and dragon traditions. Sophie sang a song from Earth, her small voice clear in the evening air. The dragons answered with their harmonies, and for a moment, two worlds joined in music. Trade began almost immediately. Dragons could cover distances in hours that would take humans days. They became messengers and transporters carrying goods and people across the planet. In return, humans shared their technology. Medicine that helped with a scale disease that had been killing dragon young, water purification systems that cleaned volcanic runoff, and art. The dragons loved human art, especially music and stories. Dr. Brooks and her team worked with the dragons to learn crystal growing. It was harder than it looked. The crystals responded to specific sound frequencies and to something the dragons called intent, a focused will that shaped the growth patterns. Humans struggled with it at first, but gradually, some people developed the knack. Maria Martinez, who had been so terrified when Sophie first met Vexcar, found that she had a talent for crystal work. She could grow small crystals that held light, creating beautiful lamps that needed no power source. The dragons praised her work, and she began teaching other colonists. The settlement started to change. New buildings grew up, combining human engineering with dragon crystal architecture. The result was beautiful. Structures that seemed to belong to the landscape instead of sitting on top of it. Power systems became more efficient as crystal technology was integrated. Food production improved as the dragons taught farming methods that enriched the soil, instead of depleting it. One evening, Sophie sat on Vexcar's back, high above the colony. She had been given special permission for these flights, though her mother still worried every single time. Below, she could see both human and dragon young playing together in the fields. It was a sight that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "Do you think more humans will come?" Sophie asked. She had learned to speak in a mix of English and dragon harmonics, creating a hybrid language that worked better than the translation devices. Vexcar rumbled, the vibration traveling through Sophie's body. The meaning came clear in her mind. Yes, more humans would come. The Horizon Dawn had sent messages to Earth before the colony had even landed. In 15 or 20 years, more ships would arrive, bringing more people seeking new homes. What will we tell them? Sophie wondered. The dragon banked, catching a warm air current and rising higher. From this height, Sophie could see the whole valley, the crystal spires of the dragon city glowing in the northern caves, the human buildings with their metal and lights. And between them, the new mixed structures that belonged to both peoples. Vexcar sang a single note, clear and strong, and Sophie understood. They would tell the new humans what they had learned, that the deadliest weapon was fear and misunderstanding, that the strongest force was the courage to say hello, that monsters only existed when you refused to see. 6 months had passed since Sophie Martinez kissed a dragon's nose and changed everything. The valley that held both the human settlement and the dragon caves looked completely different now. Where before there had been a clear line between human territory and dragon territory, now the two blended together in a way that felt natural and right. The settlement was officially called Sanctuary now, though old-timers still sometimes slipped and called it New Portland. The name had been agreed upon by both the Human Council and the Dragon Council in a ceremony that involved speeches in 2 languages and a feast that lasted 3 days. Dragons had brought roasted game from the mountains, while humans had contributed vegetables from their farms and bread from their ovens. It turned out that dragons loved human bread, especially when it was still warm. The buildings that now filled the valley were unlike anything from Earth. Human engineers and dragon crystal shapers had learned to work together, creating structures that combined metal frames with living crystal walls. The crystal could be shaped to let light through in beautiful patterns, and it stayed comfortable inside no matter the weather. Best of all, the crystals could be grown rather than built, using materials that regenerated naturally. Sophie walked through the market district on a cool morning, her hand holding onto a strap attached to the harness that Vexcar wore when he carried passengers. The dragon paced slowly beside her, his massive form drawing no more attention than a large dog would have back on Earth. Children, both human and dragon young, played around them in the street, their games a chaotic mix of tag and flying races. Sophie, called Mrs. Ellen Grant from her stall. Ellen sold crystal lights that she grew herself, having learned the art from Maria Martinez. Tell Vexcar that the large blue crystal he asked for is ready. I finished it last night. Sophie passed the message along in the hybrid language that had developed, part English words and part dragon harmonics. Vexcar rumbled his thanks and carefully picked up the crystal in his claws, holding it like the precious thing it was. The crystal would be added to the grand library that humans and dragons were building together, a place where both species' knowledge would be stored and shared. The library was Sophie's favorite place in all of Sanctuary. It was a massive building that had taken 3 months to grow, with crystal walls that showed moving images from both human and dragon history. Human books shared shelves with dragon crystal records. Children of both species studied together, learning to read both written words and the harmonic patterns that dragons use to store information in crystal. Lieutenant Aaron Peters, who now held the title of Chief Cultural Liaison, was waiting for them at the library entrance. He had changed in the 6 months since his return. He moved differently now, with a grace he had learned from the dragons. He wore clothes that mixed human and dragon design, practical but beautiful. "Good morning, Sophie," Peters said with a smile. "Good morning, Vexcar. The new students arrived today. Are you both ready?" Sophie nodded eagerly. A group of 20 young dragons and 30 human children would be starting their education today in the new school system. Sophie, despite being only 6 years old, had been asked to help with the first day. She had more experience with both species than most adults. The classroom was circular, with perches at different heights for dragons and desks for human children. The teacher was a middle-aged woman named Karen White, who had been a professor on Earth, and her assistant was a silver-scaled dragon named Whisper Song, who was young for a dragon but still very wise. Sophie watched as the young ones filed in, some nervous, some excited. A small human boy named Jake sat next to a green-scaled dragon young named Sprint Sky. They eyed each other with curiosity. By lunchtime, they would be best friends. Sophie had seen it happen dozens of times before. The lesson began with history, the story of how humans and dragons had met. Karen told it from the human side while Whisper Song provided the dragon perspective. The children listened with wide eyes as they heard about the fear and misunderstanding, the attacks and the terror. Then Sophie stood up and told her part, about flowers and a kiss and choosing to be kind instead of afraid. "But weren't you scared?" asked a little girl named Beth. The dragon was so big, Sophie thought about it carefully. "Maybe a little," she admitted. "But I was more curious than scared. And Vexcar never tried to hurt me. He was just trying to understand, same as me." Vexcar, who was sitting in on the class, rumbled softly in agreement. The young dragons chirped in response, the sound like wind chimes in a breeze. After the lesson, Sophie and Vexcar flew to the northern mountains where the main dragon city was located. The flight took less than an hour, Vexcar's powerful wings carrying them over forests and rivers that humans were still mapping. Sophie had learned to love these flights, the wind in her hair and the world spread out below like a painting. The dragon city was built inside and around a massive mountain. Crystal spires grew from the rock, some as tall as skyscrapers, glowing with soft light even in the daytime. Dragons flew between the spires in graceful patterns that looked like dancing. The whole city hummed with a sound just below human hearing, the crystal resonating with the songs of thousands of dragons. They landed on a platform near the top of the mountain where Crimson Wing, the leader of the Dragon Council, maintained his residence. The massive red dragon was ancient by dragon standards, over 300 years old. He had lived through the war with the Scourers and carried the wisdom of those hard times. "Young Sophie," Crimson Wing said in his deep, rumbling voice. Sophie could understand him now without translation. Having spent so much time learning dragon speech, "I have something to show you." He led them into a chamber deep in the Crystal Palace. The walls here were covered in images, Historical records preserved in crystal for thousands of years. Crimson Wing touched one wall with his claw, and the crystals began to glow, showing scenes from the distant past. Sophie saw the dragons before the Scourers came, living in peace and prosperity. She saw their cities covering the planet, beautiful and vast. Then she saw the arrival of the Scourers, creatures that looked like nothing she had ever seen, twisted and mechanical and wrong. The war that followed was terrible. Dragons dying by the thousands, whole cities destroyed, the planet itself scarred by weapons that tore the land apart. We almost lost everything, Crimson Wing said quietly. We survived, but we never forgot. When your people came from the sky, in ships that looked so similar to the Scourer vessels, we saw our nightmare returning. We reacted from fear and old pain. But we're not like the Scourers, Sophie said. No, agreed the old dragon. You are not. But we couldn't know that until we tried to understand instead of just fearing. Your kindness taught us to look past our fear. You reminded us that not all who come from the stars bring destruction. Crimson Wing changed the crystal display, and now Sophie saw new images. Humans and dragons working together, children of both species playing, the new buildings of sanctuary rising in the valley, a future being built on cooperation instead of conquest. This is what I wanted you to see, Crimson Wing said. This is what your courage created. When the next human ships arrive in 15 or 20 years, they will find not a struggling colony, but a thriving civilization that belongs to both our peoples. They will see what is possible when different species choose understanding over fear. Sophie felt tears in her eyes. She was only 6 years old, but she understood the importance of what Crimson Wing was saying. The story of Sanctuary would spread to other worlds. Other humans meeting other alien species would remember that a child once kissed a dragon and made peace. They flew back to Sanctuary in the afternoon. Below, Sophie could see the changes that 6 months had brought. Farms where humans and dragons worked side by side, combining human agricultural knowledge with dragon understanding of the local ecosystem. The result was crops that grew faster and healthier than anything humans had managed alone. She saw the medical center where Dr. Helen Brooks and dragon healers shared knowledge. Human medicine had saved countless dragon young from the scale disease that had plagued them for generations. Dragon healing techniques had cured human ailments that Earth medicine couldn't touch. Together, they were creating treatments that neither species could have developed alone. She saw the transport station where dragons waited to carry human passengers and cargo to distant parts of the planet. What would have been days of difficult travel on the ground became hours of comfortable flight. In return, humans had built communication systems that let dragons separated by distance talk to each other instantly, something they had never been able to do before. Most importantly, she saw the places where the two species simply lived together, dragon young and human children attending school together, mixed neighborhoods where dragon caves and human houses stood side by side, markets where both species bought and sold goods, a community that belonged to everyone. Maria Martinez was waiting when they landed near the family home. The house was bigger now, partially built with living crystal that Vexcar had helped grow. Maria had become one of the best human crystal shapers, and her work was highly valued by both species. How was school? Maria asked, hugging her daughter.